Still got people coming in. We'll just leave it a little second.
Yeah.
Tom, did you want to say anything before we get into this?
Only really to introduce this. We've been working. Project Leo is something that I think we've mentioned in the report and accounts. So members may be aware of it, but not in any great detail. It's a project which Low Carbon Hub. Actually, I don't want to steal your thunder, Mari. So there's elements of that. But the key thing for this was, and it was reflected in the survey results, is Project Leo is, we think, a fabulous opportunity to test and observe and learn about some of the future developments in networks in particular, and how we might be able to maximize the power that we generate. By being part of something rather bigger, we think we can probably achieve more than we would be able to do just with Westmill. I think that was one of the things that came in the survey very much. I am going to steal your thunder if I go any further. So actually, Mari, I'm going to pass on to you at this point. Let you and Josh do an introduction, and then this session, and indeed the other one, they are very much aimed at getting feedback from all the members. So we're very keen to hear from you, either with questions. Please ask as many as you have. There may well be lots, but also, to the extent that you have feedback or comments or thoughts or suggestions, we really want to hear those. So there will be opportunities, as I say, either to raise questions in the chat, or if you raise your hand, we will try and give you a chance to actually open up both on camera and in audio. I will try and moderate the questions, but at this point, I'm basically going to stand back and hand over to Mari and Josh, who will introduce Leo and why we think it's such a good idea.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tom. So I'm married. I'm a director at Westmill Solar, and Josh is also going to be presenting. So actually, Josh is going to start. Josh, I'll hand over to you if you want to do your intro and then start the presentation, and then I'll pick up.
Yeah, thank you. Morning, everyone. Firstly, I'm afraid I can't put my camera on. It causes my Zoom to break for some reason. I think it's trying to spare you the sight of my face. But I'm director of Westmill Wind, and I've been asked to participate and give kind of our input and help answer any questions. And I'm going to give a summary of the changing energy system as well. So could I have the next slide, please? So firstly, some kind of big caveats. I'm talking about kind of the energy system over the last 30 years or so in about 5 minutes. So it's going to be very broad brush. But it's really, I guess it's trying to help set the scene of where we were, where we are, and maybe where we're going, and why we want to get involved in the where we're going part. So historically, our energy system has been designed around centralized, large plant with a flat output, or maybe not flat output, spread the wrong way, but a controllable output. So big coal, big nuclear, big gas. So the whole system's been designed around facilitating those types of plant on a transmission system. Obviously, like kind of since I guess early 2000s, we've had lots more renewables coming on to the system, which has been great, and it's really starting to, well, it's ramped up in the last decade, and even more so now, kind of at last. And whilst it is amazing, a lot of it is wind, both onshore and offshore, and they have variable output. We can forecast it, but it's very hard to forecast, and it fluctuates a lot. And that fluctuation causes issues for the system in terms of balancing it, and in terms of frequency, and in terms of and other things like inertia and stuff like that. So that's kind of how the system is being affected by more renewables coming on. Now, with regards to the assets themselves, many were built under government support mechanisms, like the feed-in tariff or renewable obligation certificates, and those have both been ended to new entrants, and those who did get them, there's going to be a point where they're not going to receive them anymore. And so, those sites, those assets, and those developers or owners of assets need to think about what they're going to do with those assets once they can't rely on that kind of top up that the support mechanisms give them. And generally, unless you've got a really good site, with really low operating costs, it's pretty risky just to rely on purely just getting revenue from your power output, because power prices changes a lot, and it's not really enough to kind of reduce any risk in it and make it kind of very viable in the long term. So assets are going to need to diversify. And when we say diversify, we basically mean they're going to need to stack revenues. And it's kind of jargon heavy, but stack revenues basically means that you're not just relying on getting power or your revenue from the power you put into the grid. You're going to need to do other revenue streams as well. And this is where we come into the kind of flexibility markets. So they're called different things: balancing services, flexibility markets, ancillary services, all mean the same thing. They mean anything other than just sticking energy into the grid and getting pounds per megawatt hour for it. And this is likely it's not likely, it is what sites are going to need to do if the government's not going to reintroduce any sort of support mechanism, which other than CFD, which is hard for a lot of entrants and very competitive. This is the way that community energy and just generally developers are going to need to look at building new sites and utilizing the system now. And so, for assets, getting involved in flexibility provides benefits because, point two, three, it allows assets to run for longer. When it comes to the end of the subsidy, it doesn't mean that you're just going to go, well, that was it. It was a good 25 years or 20 years or whatever. Let's take them down. You'll be able to access different markets and kind of hopefully make a good financial case for the assets, which is what everyone wants. Why would you want to take them down and reduce our net renewable capacity? There's other benefits from assets participating in flexibility services as well. It means that the grid is run much better. It means there's less need for reinforcement and generally a better use of the system. The grid operators tend to work on a kind of NASA principle, which is kind of a contingency on a contingency. They work as if everything that's on the grid is going to output at 100% all the time. And then they reinforce accordingly. So you've got a very bolstered, kind of unnecessarily bolstered grid system, which costs a lot. And in reality, things don't work like that. The obvious one being solar just obviously doesn't produce at night, unless the moon's really bright, but I don't think that works. And also, if you then have a system that allows more, is being used better, there's less kind of blockers for new sites coming onto the system as well, because it reduces grid access costs as well. And then ultimately you get a lower carbon system. We'll get more renewables on, and the business case for these big centralized thermal plants is going to be reduced because that's their competition, and at the moment, their main benefit for kind of gas is that it's able to balance the system when there's lots of offshore wind coming on. But if that's being able to be done by lots of smaller assets, distributed assets, and community-owned assets, then we're not going to maybe need them, or they're going to be harder to get built. And then finally, what kind of point I thought about was there's a massive drive for kind of EV ownership, and from a grid operator's point of view, it's tricky because it's really increasing the demand on the system, and so in the broad principle, using the system better will facilitate greater EV ownership and causing less issues on the system, which is what we want, because EVs are great. So I've seen some questions come in. I don't know if we're going to just, Mary, should we crack on and then come back to them, or how do you want to?
If people don't mind, I think that might be helpful, just because then we can set out like kind of the rest of the piece about Project Leo and kind of get a spread of questions across that, and it might be that we'll pick up some other things that are relevant to some of those questions as well. So if people are happy with that, I'll say a little bit about what we're doing within the project. If you don't have anything else, Josh?
No, that was it. That was it for me. I've rambled long enough.
Okay, brilliant. Well, not brilliant that you've rambled. You haven't rambled, but thank you very much, because you set that out far better than I could have done in terms of that insight into the energy system and the markets. So Project Leo is essentially SSEN's response to this changing situation with the electricity system that Josh has described there, and there's kind of two perspectives that Project Leo takes. So one is very much the SSEN perspective. Their job is to manage the regional part and the lower voltage part of the grid, and so they're asking themselves the question: how can they manage the grid and keep it performing, so that lights are on, we've all got energy, but to do that without simply spending lots of money reinforcing the grid as all these renewables come on and as more EV charging is needed. And if by paying for flexibility services or flexible use of generation or storage, they can avoid or reduce that cost, obviously that's better for everybody, because ultimately it comes through in our energy bills. And it's worth just saying here, probably what we're talking about here is putting off reinforcement of the grid, but that's actually very, very valuable because of the cost of finance and that. So even putting back kind of upgrades to whatever it is, transformers or wires, whatever, putting that off by say 5 years could save 20% of the cost of doing that. So it's a big impact if you can delay that. The other perspective is, how can we make the best use of the system that we've got? And that's also a big part of Project Leo, and it's kind of part that the Low Carbon Hub, as a partner to that grant, is kind of championing and focusing on, and that's very relevant from our point of view, because it's kind of coming around to the purpose that we're interested in. So Low Carbon Hub invited the Westmill organisations to be part of the Smart and Fair Neighbourhood programme, which is basically place-based projects to investigate what all of this means for community energy and for creating a more equitable and clean energy system. So the first thing that we've done is look at the current situation on the site in terms of what is our local energy system, and I do mean very, very local. So literally, what have we got on the site right now? The wind generation, the solar generation, and I think, as many of you will be aware, there is the Westmill Smart Grid Community Interest Company that has been set up, and over the last few years has been investigating the opportunity for battery storage on the site. And so in addition to the wind and the solar farms, which both have connections into the local network with a certain level of generation export that they're allowed to do, the Smart Grid KIC has now secured a connection agreement that allows them to export 3 megawatts of power and also to import that amount. So worth saying, context here is that the solar farm has capacity that it can export, the wind farm has capacity that it can export, and that's the nature of our connections into the network. And the Smart Grid Community Interest Company has now secured its connection to do both import and export. Now, I'm just having a quick look to see who's in the call. Not immediately seeing anyone from the Smart Grid Kick, but please, shout if you want to chip in on that. But that's kind of where we're at right now in terms of our connections. And what you see in front of you here is, so looking at the solar data on this left-hand side and the wind data on the right-hand side across 2020. And so 2020 up and down on this axis, and then across the day, horizontally. And what the green and the amber and the red is showing you is, if it's green, it's telling you that on that export connection, so the amount we're allowed to export, that there is up to 3 megawatts of spare capacity that we could be exporting. So if it's green, we're generating, but we could be generating more, we would be allowed to export more. And obviously a very, very clear pattern from solar. The sun is shining during the day and we're generating the most in the middle of the day. And so our capacity to send electricity into the grid is used up in the middle of the day, but overnight there's plenty spare. And wind, obviously, as you'd expect, it's much more spread out and variable, although forecastable. And key thing here to look at is this blue box is basically saying that this is tea time, and tea time's peak demand on the network. And what it's saying is we actually have got loads of spare capacity most of the time that we're not using with our current agreement with SSEN, that we could be exporting energy to the local grid if we had it, and we're not. And particularly at a time when people need it. So this is immediately saying that this is the perfect time for battery storage to come in and be exporting to the grid, whether it's been charged up directly from wind and solar, or whether it's been charged up by importing energy at other times. And it's really saying, the battery connection that's been secured is for 3 megawatts in and out. But actually, you could put a 3 megawatt hour battery on the site right now, and all you'd need is the import capacity to charge it, because we've got the export capacity, at least during these periods when there's demand for that power. And so although it's by no means a detailed business case, this analysis that has been done as part of Project Leo is just telling us, if we act together as solar, as wind, and as a proposed storage facility, then we can make use of those connections that we've already got that we're not maximising. So that's, and it's a so-called shared capacity arrangement is essentially what we're talking about there. And so that's the first thing that's come out of Project Leo for us already. And then in terms of where that goes next, so one is obvious, is to start exploring what shared capacity arrangements actually mean. SSEN is going to be trialling a whole load of flexibility services, and we could take part in that. Not necessarily because we think that that's exactly what we would want to do going forwards for future business models, but we'll learn a lot by doing it and taking part and understanding what it means to actually offer that kind of service and in practice. Obviously, we want to look along with the Smart Grids kick at the business model and the case for battery storage and exactly what that would look like and how we could cooperate across the sites to make the most of it. And then in the longer term, what I've spoken about is just looking very much at our immediate site energy system and then what we're offering out. But we have previously been involved with the Swell project, which looked at kind of balancing demand with local residents against what we're generating. And so the really exciting part of this is that probably maybe a bit within Leo, but probably as a step after Leo, can we do that, but do that in a smarter, automated way that really allows us with everybody who's living locally, which is a lot of you, to be able to use that power that we're generating in the local system. So I will stop there. I appreciate that is a whirlwind and a lot of information, but yeah, we can move to questions.
Mari, can I just ask one question sort of on behalf of everybody? Is it possible you could just explain the sort of time scale of LEO? Because I know Alan raised a question about what happens in the next 5 to 20 years. LEO is obviously much shorter time frame than that, but I think that would be helpful just to put it in context.
Yes, absolutely. So LEO runs until the end of March 2023. And the kind of key bit of the timeline that's set by SSSEN is that they are running 3 trial blocks for their kind of developing a local market for flexibility services. So they will run a trial block this winter, starting November through to January. There will be a second one next summer and a third one kind of late 2022. So in the first one, it's really just LEO partners kind of getting their head around what it means. And there's an enormous amount of complexity, as you would imagine. So we're not, you know, Low Carbon Hub's running this little bit of LEO, and Low Carbon Hub is expecting that it will put its assets into those trials. But then there's the opportunity for the Westmills to be involved in some of those trials later on. So it's, yeah, I think it's probably more about looking at shared capacity arrangements now, understanding a bit about what might be involved about offering flexibility services like in the next kind of 6 months or so, with a view to having a go at that next year. And then in parallel with all of that, then saying, right, well, once we know what we can do with our site, and once we know what we might be able to do with battery storage at the site, the inevitable next thing to look forward to then is, you know, what would a project be to start working on the demand side as well. So this is very much steps on the way, as opposed to kind of realizing a wonderfully automated local energy system in the next couple of years.
Thank you. There's been a few questions on the other questions on the chat that have come through. So I mean, the first one came from Alan, which was a slightly longer term, and possibly for you, Josh, in terms of what's going to happen in the next 5 to 20 years. I think actually, Alan, it's probably quite difficult for us to plan that far ahead. It's right, we should be looking at it, but as Mari said, LEO is sort of our first step along this way. But Josh, you may be able to add something to that, and also just maybe picking up Rodney's question about CFD and what that is in terms of a potential subsidy.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of wind, I think the plan is just to kind of crack on and get the most from the site. You know, we've got aging plant, make sure that's running well, and make sure we've got kind of budget and know how to manage that. The renewable obligation certificate, so the support mechanism, expires in 27, I think. So then after that, we're kind of going merchant, as it's known, and we'll start to have to look at other ways we can get some revenue as well, which is why we're so excited about LEO, because this is really looking at that. Just in case you meant in a kind of broader sense, Alan, about the system, I guess I can answer about 5 years, and I'd say I can answer. National Grid recently did a roadmap to 2025. It's a really good document if you're like a nerd like me. But essentially, you know, they're saying we got 38% renewable generation as of 2020, and they're thinking by 2025, under one of their scenarios, it will be 75%. Offshore wind will go from just under 10 gigawatts to just under 25 gigawatts. Solar will go from 13 to 19. We'll have more interconnectors, so we'll have more, you know, despite Brexit, we'll have more connection with Europe and others. That's going to increase maybe fourfold. And obviously electric vehicles going up, battery storage quadrupling, and more people having heat pumps and things like that. Interestingly, they think that the peak demand on the system last year was 46.2 gigawatts, and I think the highest peak in 2025 will be just under 39. So, they're saying there'll be more renewables and there'll actually be less of a peak demand, and that's presumably because the system will be managed better. I guess I'll sort of come back to the site in longer term. So maybe for the 20 years, we are looking at extending the planning permission for the site, just to see if they can carry on running if they're able to do it at the time. And then CFD, yeah, sorry, Rodney. I work in the industry as well, so it's just everyone talks in acronyms. It's like kind of Orwellian in a way. But CFD is contract for difference. It's a support mechanism from the government, and essentially it's a way of kind of securing renewable capacity. And what it does is the government says we'll want so many gigawatts of different types of technology on the system. We've got this bigger pot for it, and then the eligible technologies all bid in for what price they think they can have as their strike price, and that's the price that they will definitely get for every megawatt hour they produce during a 15-year term. So for example, a site will go in and say, I need £50 a megawatt hour, and they'll be competing against other sites, and whoever goes in at the kind of, or whoever gives the overall kind of government the best way of meeting that capacity requirement at the lowest cost will get selected. And what it means that every time they produce energy, if the power price is below their strike price, they get topped up, and that comes through domestic bills, as does the FIT and the ROC. So very successful and quite a good scheme. Onshore wind and solar were kicked out of it in 2017 as part of the Tory manifesto thing, and now they've been brought back in, which is good. So I think the next one's in December. So and it's seemingly going to be very, very competitive. So yeah, that was that. Yeah. Sorry, Tom.
Thanks, Josh. I think that's really helpful. Mary, do you have anything to add to those before we hit the next questions?
No, I don't think I do. I think that covers it very nicely.
So yeah, I think it's fair to say that CFD probably isn't going to be relevant for Westmill. That might be, I might be sort of brushing it off too quickly, because we already get fairly good subsidies. So the whole point of Leo is to try and sort of work our way towards a subsidy-free and profitable future. Other questions I'm just trying to pick up. So Tim, this is probably for you, Mari, in terms of what's the battery storage capacity that's possible? It was always my understanding that this was a limiting factor.
So no, it's not a limiting factor, and it's a question. It's a good question, but it's a question that's not absolutely straightforward to answer, because what's possible technically is as big as you like. And what's possible from a kind of viability perspective is totally different and depends on what arrangements we could come up with around capacity. So very, very, very high level, the analysis that we've done, that's not what I wanted to do. Hang on, I just wanted to go back there. Yeah, so very, very, very high level. What we're saying is that we've actually got on the site over 3 megawatts, or technically kVA, capacity free much of the time. And so without any connection agreement, you could argue that you could put a 3 megawatt hour capacity battery on the site, and you'd be able to charge it right up, and at these times discharge it entirely without any kind of other connection agreement. But of course, the Smart Grid Kick has secured a connection agreement for an additional 3 megawatts of export and import capacity. So it might be that there's actually a business case that already stacks up that would allow them to put a much bigger battery storage facility in. And obviously we're kind of getting into the detail of then like an actual financial model that looks at how much do you want to be discharging at what times of day, how much capacity have you got available to do that, and what kind of prices do you think that you'll get for that. And this kind of comes back to that revenue stacking scenario that Josh described right at the beginning, because the battery business model will almost certainly be fundamentally based on delivering power into national grid markets, but you'd also expect to be able to make best use of those markets, or to be able to exploit them, as it were, by being really clever about how the arrangements that we set up from a local perspective. And that's then, everything else becomes a top up on top of that. So the potential to earn a bit more money by also delivering services to SSEN, and then we get into the really interesting stuff, which is about actually what can we achieve, not just can you deliver the flexibility and make money from it, but what can we achieve from a local perspective to really maximise out the decarbonisation of the local grid with residents and other people who are using power locally, and to do that without having to spend lots of money reinforcing the system. So sorry, not an easy answer, but one that we really want to make sure we get we work on, so that we can achieve the most we can with any battery storage that comes to the site.
Thanks, Murray. I think that's also allied slightly to James's previous question, which was about whether, if the solar farm was pointing, should the solar farm be pointing west of south rather than due south in terms of trying to produce more power later in the day. I think there's arguments for that. I mean, we clearly can't do that with our site at the moment. I think that wouldn't be worth it. But if we put battery storage on, if long term maybe we put some more solar panels up, yes, I think there'd be an argument at that point for trying to reorientate them, wouldn't there?
I think certainly you'd want to look at those kinds of options. I mean, it might be that actually it's better not to do that, but to use battery storage to get those shoulders, and that actually that's a more efficient way to do it, in which, and also can you over solar, and so put solar on, for example, which we wouldn't be able to, we wouldn't have the export capacity to export all of it when it's at max, but we could potentially use the export capacity that isn't being used by the wind farm. So there's lots of clever things we could do about the sizing of battery, the sizing of solar, and the sizing of wind on the site, and this is kind of comes back to that point about making the best use of the local grid.
Yeah, and also as technology progresses, we've got people with more electric vehicles, people with more home heating, that their own demand side, the timing of when they need their electricity is likely to change over time. So we, in one sense, I guess we don't necessarily want to go for plumb for one absolute fixed thing, because we can find that the world moves on and leaves us sort of slightly stranded.
Absolutely. And just to pick up on that, because James has also raised the point about moving off gas for home heating. So one of the other place-based projects that's running as part of Project Leo is centred around Deddington and Dunstew, which is already off gas for home heating, but they're not electric at the moment. And they're going to be trialling the installation of electric heat pump heating systems for domestic households, and those heat pumps will be set up with kind of the ability to be controlled so that they can turn up and down in response to if there's a need for managing energy in that part of the grid. And so so basically looking at whether there's a case that householders can be rewarded for allowing a little bit of flexible use on their heating systems, obviously without freezing anyone, in order to make, give them the benefit of willing to be flexible, and then also manage that significantly increased electricity demand. There's also a project that's up in Orkney that has been running for the last year or so, where they have looked at the same thing, where they basically did, the problem in Orkney is that they have a lot of curtailment of wind, so they're switching off the wind farms, and that happens automatically when it's needed to protect the system. But what they've tried to do is have a demand turn up scheme where people who have electric, I think they were storage heaters, if they're not full, those storage heaters get switched on so that they will take up the demand, and they'll be using that while, to avoid the wind being curtailed there. But interesting that, different places, different challenges, so different solutions.
That's interesting. There's an interesting comment from Chris too, saying, "Wish I could store energy from my solar panels." Are there any examples of that in the other Smarter and Fairer Neighbourhood schemes?
So at a domestic level, I don't think we have. There was a project that ran in the Rose Hill area in Oxford that looked at exactly that. And interestingly, at the time, it's a few years ago now, really from a kind of individual investment perspective, it didn't really stack up. So you would get a carbon benefit, but you would be paying for that over time. Actually, though, Low Carbon Hub has installed a battery at Rose Hill Primary. So the hub is running a site where they've got solar on the rooftop and a battery on the same site, and we'll be looking at how they can use those effectively together. But that's a different scale, of course. So it's something that I think everybody's just keeping a watch on, because obviously, that's ideal, but the numbers don't necessarily work out unless you're willing to pay for the knowledge that you've used your own power and avoided using grid power.
Yeah. There's also, Chris, and this was a comment in one conversation that we've had. So I don't want to sort of raise expectations unduly, but that we have been looking as boards about other member services, and one idea that's come up is can we try and facilitate, for example, try and get solar panels on people's roofs and maybe include some kind of battery storage in that as a package, almost as a member benefit. So I think there are, at a residential household level, there will be technology. And people have mentioned it on the chat, the technology is moving along quite quickly all the time, and there will be a balance of these things. And
I chip in, actually, I think, as Tom, as you said, that's something that we're kind of looking at anyway. The part of Leo that is interesting in that context is that these place-based projects are really asking the question, not just what can we do, but also how can we do more if we act collectively. So, so not everybody can have solar panels on the roof, or the orientation isn't right. So you wouldn't necessarily put things in on an individual basis. But if we were to look at it from a community scheme perspective, can we put more solar in general than we might otherwise have been able to? And can we also enable the benefits of that solar to be, spread across the community, even though some people, on their individual roof for technical reasons wouldn't be able to do it? Can they be part of how that energy is used and benefit from that?
Thank you. That's interesting. And there's another thing come on the chat from Catherine saying there's already a scheme, solar schemes by IDEA in Wiltshire. Do you know about that, Mary? Is that something?
I'm not familiar with that one, but definitely would love to find out more about it, because, as I say, it's changing all the time. So, the more we can see, the better.
Brilliant. I think I'm just trying to work out, there was a couple of comments about sort of rotating. Catherine, that's great. Thank you very much for that. Question from Mike Holmes. Only caught past what was being said about heat pumps and exporting energy. Is this at domestic level?
Yes. It's domestic level. We're only expecting it to be, tens of properties. So it's not going to be the kind of scale where you would see kind of massive delivery of services to SSEN, but I think it's very interesting from the perspective of testing out, whether how these systems work, how they work for people in households, and the kind of first steps along the way of can people in households be, either paid directly for their willingness to have the system used flexibly, or possibly it's about, you know, it's maybe not very much money, but we could, if lots of people are willing to have a little bit of flex on how their heating system works, that money can be pooled and put into community benefit projects.
Sounds good. So Chris said can't find a local supplier to even talk to me about heat pumps. I think that's a real problem nationwide, effectively, isn't it? It's not yet it's not yet a technology that people are comfortable with on any kind of mass scale.
And a really interesting challenge, right, given where we are in terms of national carbon budgets and the assumptions about the level of electrification of heating. Yeah,
and some pretty optimistic, I would say, timetables in terms of cutting people off gas networks and stuff like that. From Helen, any dangers of large-scale hacking? Interesting.
Yes. That's a really good question. So the approach so I think the first answer to that question is yes, of course, there are always cybersecurity issues with any of these systems, and that's something we need to take very seriously. Within Project Leo, at least as far as the Smart and Fair Neighbourhood project is concerned, we're looking at some of these systems, but we're doing them in quite a cautious way. So for, you know, with Beddington and Dunstew, it's just the heat side of things that we're looking at and the ability to control that. You know, we're kind of doing it in consultation with the people who are involved very clearly, and there'll be limits on it. We're also doing a bit of work that's really exploratory to just understand a bit more around what is possible in terms of understanding domestic electricity use and how it might be controlled. And literally the first stages of that we're only doing with people who are employed as part of Project Leo, so that, you know, it's very, very small scale. While we get our heads around it, we won't be attempting to do anything at scale until we're absolutely clear that the offer that's being made to any householders is safe and understood in those terms. There are a lot of technologies coming on for that, though, and so I said before, one of the things that Leo's interested in is that collective benefit. But if you're just purely looking from an individual household perspective, so there's a company called Equiwatt that will now, if you kind of use their sockets and let them control some of your appliances, they'll pay you in shopping vouchers for that. So actually very much like Swell, but just a little bit more automated. But the difference there is it's not about collective benefit, it's purely about what you do kind of as every individual household. So it's not looking at the sum of the parts.
Interesting. Mike Wise, your comment about Farringdon and solar streets, just while I'm thinking about it, I mean, Farringdon is obviously right close up to Westmill. I mean, if there's something interesting that, I don't know whether that's community funding or something else anyway, I think if there's something going on that close to the site that we can either help, you know, with in some way, shape or form, I think that would be very, very interesting, just in terms of trying to get us closer into the neighbourhood. And I think one of the things I would say strategically we're very keen on trying to do is renew the membership. I mean, we can't just extend the life of both the solar and the wind farms without bringing in new members into that. So if that's a way of bringing in new members and actually helping the overall messaging of more domestic renewables and working together more closely, I think we'd love to get involved with that. So that's a really good one to pick up on. There's been some good little comments too for recommendations in terms of people who might be able to help. I've had a warning from FX. We're going to shut down at 10 o'clock, and we're going to shut. It's quite a hard shutdown apparently when we leave the breakout room. So you will be automatically sort of rushed back into the main meeting room once we finish. Are there any other sort of closing comments, either Josh, Mary, that anybody else out there would like to raise?
I think from my perspective, just thanks for all of the questions and the comments. It's been really interesting to see what everybody's response has been, and you know, clear that actually, like, having focused on this one exercise, it's enabled us to have a discussion about some really quite exciting things. So hopefully lots more to come.
Yeah, and Just as a side point, I'm really interested in this shared grid capacity exercise. I think it's going to have far-reaching benefits for the industry and for the community energy sector as well. So I'm really looking forward to that. But yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone for your questions and comments as well. It's been really good, good discussion.
Brilliant. Rodney, thank you. Thanks for that extra bit of information, Mike. I think we've picked up all the questions. I'm sorry, I'm just going through them again, but I think we have miraculously finished pretty much on time, which is great. And had a really good 45-minute session, actually. It's really, really interesting to see how many of these things are going on sort of separately.